Welcome to Lesson 5 of this 6-part Blood Moon series presented by RootSource. This lesson is entitled Waves of History. I'm Bob Odell, and although I'm not an Israeli Jew, but an American Christian, Gidon Ariel asked me to teach this course. Okay, we've asked this question multiple times, and now it's time I told you what I think. I believe that God has designed His heavenly systems so that they can speak specifically. But we don't get to control the message or the timing of that message. In other words, the heavens do not serve us and our interests. We serve God and His interests. And when we do that, sometimes He may choose to show us things about His interests through the heavens. And His interests can be summed up in one word: glory. If the message we think we are hearing does not result in more glory for God, I guarantee you that we did not hear correctly. And in part 6, I will tell a story about this, about the big mistake I almost made in preparing these lessons. We've also raised 3 foundational questions and answered 2 of them. A fact is accurate enough when we're willing to use them against our own arguments. And secondly, the way to see world history through God's eyes is to see it through the lens of Israel, both the people and the nation. Also in the last lesson, I said that the blood moons reveal God as a covenant-keeping God, that they are a gift from God to Israel, and that we Christians are privileged to be spiritually grafted into that root. So today, I'd like to start by proposing an answer to the 3rd foundational question. How many Bible verses does it take to feel good about a theory? Well, the first answer is simple. The more the better. You can never have too many. But I won't just leave it there, because there's something else very important that needs to be said. Big theories require more scripture than smaller theories. So we must be careful not to jump immediately at any new theory that's based on a small number of verses. Now, every verse is valuable, but when the context is small, it's just too easy to miss an emphasis in the application. On the other hand, the theory I'm proposing in this lesson has many verses attached to it, I'll explain that in a minute, and makes no claim at all about what the Messiah's arrival will be, which allows you to continue believing what you want to believe about that. I'm not saying when He's returning. My view is that the blood moons are not specifically about that. But don't get me wrong. If the moon suddenly, for no apparent reason, started turning blood red, and then the sun also started turning dark, then I'll immediately think that the great and terrible day of the Lord is at hand. Okay, so let's talk about the details of this theory so you can decide for yourself. The theory is that the lunar eclipses highlight certain feast days and make them special. So where are we going to get some Bible verses about special feast days? Well, how about these? These are the first feast days ever instituted by God, just after the Exodus. How can feast days be any more special than that? And there are large amounts of scripture explaining the things that happened before, during, and after. It's the book of Exodus. First, we learn from scripture that the period before the feast days, the very first feast days, was the period of greatest difficulty. We had the children of Israel in slavery, in turmoil. They are in anguish, crying out to God. We have plagues, broken promises from a Pharaoh. We have an unexpected benefactor, Moses. And finally, we have a decision to get out. Where did they go? Into the wilderness, of course. But not just to die there, but to be prepared for their eventual movement into the promised homeland. In addition, between Passover and Sukkot in the first year, we have struggles of various kinds, including some military conflicts. We have the miraculous victory of the Red Sea crossing, and we have the nagging attack from the Amalekites, where Moses needed help from Aaron and Hur to hold up his hands with the staff for them to prevail. And God said they will be at war with Amalek continually. You also had a spiritual treasure that came in this period, the Torah itself, being handed down from God on Mount Sinai. The next thing to notice in Scripture is that once you get past Sukkot, there are no more wars at least in this period of time. And I can report to you right now that all the blood moon tetrads indicate this feature, that once you get past the second blood moon, the immediate conflicts are over. And what about all the difficulties that occur before the blood moon tetrads? How does that line up with recent history? Well, everything fits perfectly in 1492 because all the action happened beforehand. It also fits well in 1948 because most of the conflict happened before the blood moon started in 49. Let's look at the case of 1948 in more detail. We have all the elements here: slave camps, and even worse with the Holocaust. There was great death and destruction all around Europe, devastating the land. We had broken promises to the Jews of a homeland and then preventing them to immigrate there. We had an unexpected benefactor in Harry Truman, who was only in that position because FDR died. There was huge anguish, and as soon as the 48 war was over, we had many Jews making aliyah to Israel from all over the world. And in 49 and 50, we had celebrations in Israel. There was dancing in the streets. Can you imagine how special those feast days would have been? Now, when we look at 67 and 2014, we see something interesting. Both of those tetrads had wars. So let's look at those wars in more detail. Both of those wars occurred between the first and second blood moons of that cycle. The Six-Day War reminds me of the miraculous victory of the Red Sea, in that it was short and nothing short of miraculous. The U.S. Armed Forces studies wars to see what they can learn for future conflicts, but they have said there is nothing that they can learn from the Six-Day War because you can't plan miracles. In 2014, you have Israel protecting itself from attacks in Gaza. This war was not a definitive victory for Israel, but just a pushing back until they stopped attacking. This is exactly like the Amalekite war that happened after the Red Sea crossing. In fact, Jewish rabbis made this very connection last summer and noted its similarity, Operation Protective Edge, to how the Amalekites also targeted Israel's women and children, just like Hamas has done with the firing of their rockets into Israel. But while there are some key similarities between these recent tetrads and the ancient patterns, there are some things missing. For instance, in 1967, where's the slavery? And where's the plagues that preceded it? And in what way did the Jews leave home after the Six-Day War? You could make the case, and it's true, that this is when they started to settle into the West Bank. But it's still not as definitive as the influx of new arrivals after 1948. So as I looked honestly at this theory, I saw a problem. No single tetrad combines everything seen in the original Exodus. So do we give up, or is there a solution? Well, I have a surprise for you. Any surfer will tell you that big waves come in sets. Actually, what you hear most commonly from surfers is that they come in sets of 3. Tetrads come in waves also. You have about 500 years of quiet, followed by sets of either 1, 2, or 3 blood moon tetrads in a much shorter period. That's not random. It's science. So if this is what we see in science, can we justify the idea that God moves in waves of history also? The Northern Kingdom had more than one wave of its exile, although the main date is considered to be 721 BC. The same thing for the Southern Kingdom in 586 BC. And in more modern times, the Jews suffered 2 waves of destruction. The temple fell in 70 AD, and all Jews were banished from Jerusalem in 135 AD after the Bar Kokhba revolt. And if you look at the blood moons and these days, you will often notice a pattern of 65 years between them. We think of the Exodus as one big event, but even the Exodus could be viewed in multiple waves. Moses was the forerunner of all of Israel at age 40 when he ran from Pharaoh into the desert and stayed there for 40 years. And then the people of Israel did the same thing with him 40 years later. So you can view the Exodus in either one step or 2. So does the Jewish migration during the 2,000 years of exile come in waves? And if so, do they match the pattern of the tetrads? Yes, they match them quite well. We have the attacks by Rome before the first set, the upheaval of Islam before the second set, the forced conversions and inquisitions before the third set, and the Holocaust before the fourth set. And after each one of these, we had a great migration to Babylon, once again as had happened in the past, and then Spain, and then to the Americas, and finally into Israel. Let's follow the trail in detail and see if our theory still holds up.